request her to introduce our honorable speaker for today evening and to introduce the topic to all of you guys.
Thank you so much, and a real privilege to be addressing you people, such a prestigious forum, and I've known Dr. Chauhan for more than 2 decades now, and his tremendous interest in academics is really impressive. Thank you so much, Dr. Chauhan, for this opportunity. So, before I invite my speaker, I just would want to make 2 comments about my journey as a physician. So let me start by saying that perhaps for me the more important day than the doctor's day every year is the teacher's day. I've taught students for DNB for the last 18 years, and they are in every corner of the world. So academics is really close to my heart, and when I get wishes on Teacher's Day, that makes me the most blessed doctor to be around. My day began today with a teaching lecture at 8 o'clock in the morning, another one at 1 o'clock to teach 50 students about the nuances of insulin usage, and we're talking now about saroglitazar. And the last 18 years of teaching and last 24 years in Max Healthcare, I was the first doctor to join Max Healthcare. It has never bothered me as to who owns Max Healthcare. And believe me, in the last 24 years, nobody has told me my revenue sheet. Nobody talks to me about how much revenue I've earned. Nobody talks to me about MG, so that is a misconcept. As doctors, we are very privileged, we are very happy to be serving Indian citizens. I did not go abroad and start working in US. I stayed in this country. I worked through the COVID pandemic. And if I look at one foreign patient, I still look at 99 Indian patients. So that perspective of a corporate hospital, I want to set right in today's forum and say that we are as much Indians, we are as much dedicated, and revenue does not get talked to us in any of the forums. I'm very happy to be serving the Indian population, and my only mantra is Seva Bhav and teaching. I am not talked about as to how much did I earn in the previous month and how much did I convert. Thank you so much.
Would you introduce please the speaker?
Thank you so much. Now to the main agenda. It was something that I really needed to speak, so sorry I took a few more minutes. Okay, proud privilege to welcome Dr. Ruchi Verma, who is a colleague from Max Healthcare. Dr. Ruchi did her MBBS from Allahabad and then did her DNB in family medicine. Almost 25 years of serving as a doctor, both with Max as well as organizations like the State Bank of India. Very, very knowledgeable in terms of preventive medicine as well as in terms of diabetes care, and an extremely good academician, a very empathetic doctor, and she'll be talking to you about a molecule which is an Indian molecule. We are so proud that is being recognized internationally, that is saroglitazar or Lipaglyn. So over to you, Dr. Ruchi.
Just before we get started, friends, my duty just to tell you that it is continuous, uninterrupted CME number 890 with blessings of all of you guys, and I'm not going to give up till we complete 1000. After that I will give it to Dr. S.K. Podar sir. Dr. Monica, thank you very much. Please take your seat. Over to Dr. Ruchi Verma ma'am to introduce a topic, to take us through the journey of this wonderful molecule called saroglitazar and fatty liver, and all this myth about fatty liver grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. The nomenclature changed from NAFLD to MAFLD and MASLD. Every myth about steatosis in the liver, how difficult it is to treat this, and how is it a surrogate marker of metabolic diseases that faces the medical profession. And therefore, please, we would require 25 minutes of serious listening, and Dr. Vinay Agarwal sir would leave in about 15 minutes. फिर मिलोगे कभी फिर मिलोगे कभी, इस बात का वादा कर लो, एक और हसीन मुलाकात का वादा कर लो।
Thank you, sir, and a very good evening to this very esteemed audience. It's actually a privilege for me to be addressing
Can't hear you.
so many seniors.
Can't hear you here.
I don't
Mike.
So thank you, Dr. Monica ma'am, and thank you everyone for this. Sorry.
You're okay with that or you doing this?
So thank you for inviting me, and I'm indeed privileged to be addressing this esteemed audience. So many seniors, most of you are my teachers. I have learned from you, so here I am today. As far as Monica ma'am, I can just say that she is one of the greatest academicians that I know, and day in and day out she's teaching students at Max Healthcare. Today also she started at 7 a.m. and here she is today with me. So thank you ma'am. And the topic for today's discussion is NAFLD, which is now called MASLD, that is Metabolic Dysfunction Associated Fatty Liver Disease. All of us are treating patients day in and day out of this disease. So adding a new dimension in the management of NAFLD is a drug that is saroglitazar, which we are going to talk about today. And insulin resistance, as we all know, is the common link for various metabolic conditions, whether it is type 2 diabetes or atherogenic diabetic dyslipidemia or NAFLD itself. And the prevalence in India is increasing for all these diseases day by day, with 77 million mark crossed as far as diabetic patients are concerned, and insulin resistance is the pathological hallmark. Insulin resistance also leads to high triglycerides, which are responsible for causation of cardiovascular disease, and the prevalence in India is up to the 34% population affected. And it also leads to diabetes and is a major risk factor for NAFLD, and up to 32% of population as per data today is supposed to be affected with this disease. Now, as far as the pathophysiology and the classification goes, NAFLD can be classified into the NAFL as well as the NASH, that is the NASH. So actually the inflammatory condition of NAFL is what is NASH. So you have the normal liver and then you have the steatotic liver. This is based on the imaging techniques, and of course the gold standard is still the liver biopsy, that is the histopathology. So in NAFL we have the fatty liver without any inflammation or hepatocyte ballooning, whereas in NASH we have the fatty liver with inflammation and hepatocyte ballooning. And thereafter comes the stage of cirrhosis, where there is increasing fibrosis, apoptosis and cell death, leading to cirrhosis and ultimately hepatocellular carcinoma. So the worldwide prevalence of NAFL is just about 25%, but just about 20% of such patients progress to NASH, and then about the prevalence of cirrhosis is 0.5 to 2.6%. As far as the diagnostic criteria is concerned, more than 5% steatosis in the liver is there in NAFL as well as NASH, with the presence of insulin resistance that is determined with the help of the imaging techniques, which we'll see as we go ahead. So who are the population at risk? Obviously people who are at risk of metabolic dysfunction, that is type 2 diabetic patients, obese patients, patients having dyslipidemia and high blood pressure. These are the metabolic conditions which are most predisposed, and the PCOS patients also. The prevalence of NAFLD in obese patients is about 80%, and the presence of NAFLD in diabetic patients is to the range of 70 to 80%. Of this, 50% are supposed to progress to advanced fibrosis. The odds ratio for NASH is 1.76 in diabetic versus non-diabetic patients, and for cirrhosis is 2.57. So obviously diabetic patients are more at risk for NASH and for cirrhosis. I would not go into the very much details of the biochemistry, but yes, there is definitely metabolic dysregulation happening at the cellular level, which is leading to all this. So in terms of a substrate overload which is there from the high fat and high sugar intake, it is leading to increased lipolysis and increased myosteatosis, in turn which is leading to the lipotoxicity and the apoptosis and cell death, and the cells are coming under the endoplasmic reticulum stress. So increased dietary intake is in turn causing the increased lipotoxicity in the liver. As far as free fatty acid overload is concerned, it is happening in the adipocyte tissue as well, leading to the ER stress and release of the inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, and the decreased adiponectin levels. There is also mitochondrial dysfunction happening in terms of the metabolic inflexibility and decreased ATP production, and then ultimately causing insulin resistance and lipotoxicity in the hepatocytes, which is obviously a state of oxidative stress. This leads to inflammation and cell death, increased fibrosis, and hepatic stellate cell activation. NAFLD is also the major precursor of cardiometabolic complications. So once all this metabolic dysfunction is happening at the level of the cells, it is leading to insulin resistance and steatosis in the liver, in terms of also mitochondrial dysfunction happening and inflammation and fibrosis happening. It is leading to the cholesterol accumulation and inflammation at the level of the vascular smooth muscle cells. Also the decreased lipid oxidation and inflammation happening at the level of the heart, and the ER stress and cell death and inflammation happening in the immune cells. Also increased lipolysis and ER stress and inflammation happening at the adipocyte level and the myocyte level. So all this is actually a vicious cycle and a nexus which is intertwined in each other, that is NAFLD, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. They are all related to each other. When we look at the association of some common comorbidities with NAFLD, these are obesity, diabetes, hypertension, hypertriglyceridemia, and metabolic syndrome. And all these comorbidities have an increased association as far as non-alcoholic fatty liver is concerned and as far as non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is concerned. So when we look at the real world data, there is still a huge diagnostic gap, which means that probably all these conditions are very much underdiagnosed. So this slide that you're seeing is a European study slide, and it was taken from a primary healthcare center across Italy, Netherlands, Spain and UK, wherein the total number of individuals enrolled were more than 21 million, and the number of individuals with more than 1 year of registration were about more than 17 million, but the number of reported NAFLD patients was just about 1% of that total population. So this actually shows a huge diagnostic gap in this disease, and hence comes the importance of screening. So screening is the most important step, and all of you know that mostly we diagnose such patients in a asymptomatic manner. So they don't present to us as such with any complaint, and majority are discovered just by chance. Either as a part of the routine annual health checkups, or in diabetic, lipid and hypertension clinics as a part of their annual reviews, or in a medical insurance or occupational health checks. And only 17% of patients with diabetes may have significant fibrosis when they are assessed by the non-invasive imaging tools. So I think screening is most important, and all guidelines also say that. So American guidelines say that increasing number of metabolic diseases is equal to the increasing risk of progressive liver disease, and hence screening is very important to determine such, to identify such patients. So does the European guidelines say that screening is recommended in patients at high CVD risk, including type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome. Also ADA states that NASH and fibrosis screening is recommended in persons with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, and those who are having elevated ALT, that is liver enzymes, or a fatty liver diagnosed on an ultrasound. Another thing that I would like to emphasize is that the AST-ALT ratio does not rule out NASH, because liver enzymes may be absolutely normal in more than 80% of the NAFLD patients, and ALT and AST are not very sensitive markers for NAFLD or NASH. So there is a poor correlation between the ALT levels and the histology, and still the gold standard is the histology, that is the liver biopsy. But yes, we cannot do that for every patient, and hence we need to go in for the other imaging techniques like an ultrasound or a fibroscan. So some ALT typically also decreases with advanced fibrosis, and as NASH progresses, the AST-ALT ratio may actually increase. So here are some scores to identify advanced fibrosis. The ones which we are most commonly following nowadays is this FIB-4 score. It is available on the apps and through the links. You can just enter the values and you have the score in front of you. So the NAFLD fibrosis score, which is called the NFS, takes into account all these parameters like the age, AST, ALT, platelet count, BMI, albumin, and the impaired fasting glucose. And a score less than -1.455 rules out fibrosis, whereas a score more than 0.676 predicts fibrosis. As far as the FIB-4 score is concerned, it takes into account the age, AST, ALT, and the platelet count. And a score less than 1.3 rules out fibrosis, whereas a score more than 3.25 predicts fibrosis. So there is a cutoff and there is a stage in between. So a patient who comes to you with a score between 1.3 and 3.25 will be put under the indeterminate category and still would be further screened to determine the fibrosis based on other further modalities as far as radiological modalities are concerned. These scores are very easy and instant to calculate to evaluate the risk of fibrosis in the NAFLD patient. You can just put it on Google, FIB-4 calculator, and you have this in front of you. Enter the age, the liver enzymes, and the platelet count, and you have the score. Now coming to the FibroScan, which is again a imaging tool which is widely used in our practice these days, that is the vibration controlled transient elastography. It is directly related to the tissue stiffness. So the stiffer the liver, the faster the shear wave will propagate, and it is most reliable in ruling out advanced hepatic fibrosis. It has two probes, so it has an M probe for BMI less than 30 patients and an XL probe for patients whose BMI is more than 30. And you have, generally when you see the report, you have two values. So one is the liver stiffness measurement, that is the measurement in kilopascals. And then you have another value, that is the CAP, which determines the fat content of the liver. Again, liver biopsy is the confirmative test, but it has limitations such as psychological disturbances, risk of bleeding, pain or infection, and inter-individual variability also, sampling variability as well. It also has some benefits that it is the gold standard and establishes the diagnosis of NASH. It rules out other processes, that is, it rules out the secondary causes also. And it also has benefits in terms of access to early fibrosis. So we can diagnose the patient in an early stage. Now coming to the role of saroglitazar in the management of NAFLD, which is the main topic for today. So there is a need to prevent further progression of the disease from NAFL to NASH to cirrhosis to the hepatocellular carcinoma. And of course, diet and lifestyle changes are the mainstay of treatment, the mainstay of management even now. In fact, pharmacological treatment of comorbid conditions like diabetes, dyslipidemia and hypertension is also very important, because these are the patients who would present to you with NAFL. So this is the algorithm, management algorithm, which the American guidelines gave us in 2022. So we need to identify the high-risk groups for the development of NAFLD in terms of obesity, pre-diabetes, diabetes or hepatic steatosis, which we would get to know from imaging and the liver enzymes. And then after a careful history and physical examination and after ruling out the secondary causes, in terms of any hereditary disorder or pregnancy or any drug that the patient is taking, which is a steatogenic drug. We would come to the diagnosis of NAFLD and then classify the patient based on this FIB-4 score into a low risk, indeterminate risk and high risk. At the same time, a multidisciplinary approach is required in treating such patients in terms of management of the obesity, diabetes, hypertension and the atherogenic dyslipidemia as well. Again, a very important aspect of this is the algorithm for prevention of cirrhosis, because very few patients will progress to cirrhosis. So after classifying these patients according to the FIB-4 index into the risk categories, we determine the liver stiffness measurement by elastography, and there's also a test called the ELF blood test, which is again takes into account many parameters. So based on these two, we can classify our patient at low risk, indeterminate risk and high risk. High risk and indeterminate risk patients would obviously be referred to a gastroenterologist or a liver specialist, a hepatologist for further management. And low risk patients can be managed by the primary care team, the endocrinologist, and also the team taking care of the obesity management. So cirrhosis risk is higher if the patient is diabetic or aged more than 50 years, has a high BMI, has more metabolic risk factors and genetic factors, and that also should be taken into account. So I would say that after a careful history taking and clinical examination, we can go in for the fibroscan in a certain set of patients to determine the category of patients which require care. Now, as far as the non-pharmacological approach of this disease is concerned, which is the most important approach, because this is a lifestyle disease, and weight loss and exercise and diet explanation to the patient is very important. So weight loss and diet has its own significance, and about a 3 to 5% is required to improve the steatosis and 7 to 10% to improve the histopathological features including fibrosis. Diet we can choose according to the patient preference, whether it's a low or moderate fat diet or a ketogenic diet or a high protein Mediterranean diet. But the Guru mantra is that you should ask the patient to count the calories, reduce the calories and emphasize on the exercise part independent of the macronutrient composition of the diet. A very few subset of such patients may require bariatric surgery, but these would obviously be individuals who otherwise also meet the criteria for bariatric surgery, and it would be very premature to consider bariatric surgery as an established option to treat NASH. This slide just depicts the percentage of weight loss associated with the histological improvement in NAFLD. It is a study which was taken from Havana, Cuba, and it basically, the conclusion of the study was that with improved weight loss, so patients who had more than 10% weight loss, they went into fibrosis regression and NASH resolution, as well as the ballooning and inflammation improvement. Patients really benefit those who are able to achieve a weight loss of more than 10% and sustain it also in the long term. Although patients who sustained it in the long term was less than 10%. So as you are able to motivate your patient for weight loss, you would be also treating this disease in terms of NASH resolution, fibrosis regression and the inflammation improvement, in turn improving the fatty liver. So who could be the ideal patient to start with medications? Again, early stage NASH at high risk for disease progression, that is people who have metabolic syndrome, diabetes or age more than 50 years. Active NASH with high necroinflammatory activities and progressive NASH. So all such patients are ideal patients to start with medications. Rest of the patients we can first try with diet and lifestyle measures. Again, one more score which I want to tell is the NAFLD activity score, which is more in terms of measuring the outcome of the treatment. So a reduction in the NAFLD activity score means the regression of the fibrosis stage, and that is more to do with the treatment part. Now these are some drugs which we are using in NAFLD, which are still considered as, all of them are considered as off-label medications. So none of them is actually approved, but yes, we are all using them every day in our day-to-day practice. Metformin, vitamin E, PPAR gamma agonists are very commonly used. GLP-1 receptor agonist, pentoxifylline, ursodeoxycholic acid, obeticholic acid, silymarin and statins. So as you can see that most of the guidelines have said that there is insufficient evidence or they are not beneficial or it is not mentioned and not recommended. But as far as PPAR gamma agonists are concerned, the European guidelines say that you could consider their use in selected diabetic patients, and in fact pioglitazone, which is also a PPAR gamma agonist, it is indicated in the biopsy proven NASH patients as far as the American guidelines state. We could also consider pioglitazone in adults regardless of diabetes according to the NICE guidelines. So it still has some data. Rest does not have much of data, but yes, it is being used and we are getting results in our patients also. So it is all about monitoring the patient as we go along, and it's a more of, I would say, hit and try. But yes, as far as data is concerned and approvals are concerned, none of the drugs are actually approved. So saroglitazar, and we're talking about its clinical data. It is a good glitazar and manages the link between diabetes and NAFLD. It is India's first approved for the atherogenic diabetic dyslipidemia in 2013 and the world's first which is approved for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the year 2020. So just a short word about saroglitazar, which is a dual PPAR agonist and its mechanism of action. So PPAR alpha is found in the liver, kidney, heart and muscle, and it is implicated in the uptake and oxidation of the fatty acids and the lipoprotein metabolism. PPAR gamma is mainly expressed in the adipose tissue with beneficial effects on glucose homeostasis by increasing the insulin sensitivity and the glucose disposal and preventing the loss of beta cell mass in the pancreas. So saroglitazar is a dual PPAR alpha and gamma agonist, and through the activation of these transcriptional factors, it reduces the triglyceride predominantly through the PPAR alpha agonism, and it reduces the insulin resistance and controls the blood sugar levels predominantly through the PPAR gamma agonism. So it has both. And once this review analysis of 18 clinical studies was done, they were all real-world evidence studies published in various journals. It suggested that saroglitazar was seen to reduce triglycerides to the extent of 45 to 62%, LDL levels by 20.3%, A1C to the extent of 0.7 to 1.6%, the liver enzyme by ALT by 0.7 to 1.6%, and non-HDL also by 21 to 36%. So I'll just quickly go through some studies, 2 or 3 studies. This was actually aimed to prove that saroglitazar improves the glucose metabolism and the insulin sensitivity index. It was a single center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and the patients were treatment-naive type 2 diabetic patients whose A1C ranged between 7 to 9% with a serum fasting triglyceride of more than 150 milligram per deciliter. It was a small study, and subjects were randomized to receive saroglitazar 4 milligram and placebo in a 1:1 distribution for 4 months. So the study duration was 4 months, and saroglitazar was seen to improve the insulin sensitivity significantly at the end of 4 months and also the glucose metabolism. Another phase 2 study which established the efficacy of saroglitazar in NAFLD patients. It was a US-based study. In this study, saroglitazar, there were 4 arms to this study. Saroglitazar was given in a dose of 1 milligram, 2 milligram, 4 milligram and placebo, and the total number of patients were 104 with diagnosed NAFLD, and the study duration was 16 weeks. The graph that you are seeing shows the data with just 4 milligram dose, and the objective of course was the change in the efficacy endpoints in the full analysis set population from baseline to week 16. So it was seen that change in the ALT levels was significant to the extent of 44.39%. There was also an absolute percentage change in the liver fat content to the extent of 4.21%, and the percentage of patients with liver fat reduction by 10% was 55.7%, and the percentage of patients with liver fat reduction by 30% was about 41%. So it proved that saroglitazar was indeed a very efficacious drug as far as reduction of liver fat was concerned. Another biopsy-driven phase 3 study from India proved the effectiveness of PPAR agonist saroglitazar in non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. This was actually a positive data from preclinical and clinical studies, and the inclusion criteria was that adult patients 18 to 65 years were enrolled in this study with a histological confirmation of NASH without cirrhosis. Also activity score of more than 4 with a score of at least 1 in each component. So there are 3 components of this NAFLD activity score, that is steatosis, lobular inflammation and hepatocyte ballooning. Each is given the score between 0 and 3, with hepatocyte ballooning being given the score between 0 and 2. So the total score is 8, and more than 8 is the patients who are cirrhotic patients. So the key exclusion criteria was pregnancy and lactating females, patients with a history of alcohol consumption of more than 30 grams per week for men and more than 20 grams per week for women for 3 consecutive months in the last 5 years, or patients on drug abuse. Patients having unstable angina, acute MI were also excluded. Previous liver biopsy that demonstrated the presence of cirrhosis, such patients were also excluded. And type 2 diabetic patients treated with agents other than metformin, sulfonylureas and DPP-4 inhibitors. Type 1 diabetic patients, patients on fibrates, drug-induced fatty liver, patients having history of bariatric surgery or on a weight loss regimen already in the last 8 weeks, and acute liver disease or history of chronic liver disease were excluded from this study. And it was seen the primary endpoint was met, that is a decrease in the NAFLD activity score to more than 2 points was observed in 52.3% of patients without worsening of the fibrosis at week 52. So we also saw a mean reduction in all the secondary endpoints by saroglitazar at week 52 in terms of the activity score, that is the steatosis, hepatocyte ballooning and lobular inflammation. Also in terms of the liver parameters, that is the decrease in the liver enzymes, ALT, AST, GGT and ALP, and the lipid parameters, reduction in terms of reduction in the triglyceride, total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol and non-HDL cholesterol. So again, some scientific reports state that saroglitazar in patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and diabetic dyslipidemia. Another real-world study was done, and it was a prospective observational real-world Indian study which was aimed to determine the efficacy and safety of this drug in patients with NAFLD and diabetic dyslipidemia. Of the 163 patients screened, 107 were included and 101 completed 24 weeks of treatment. Blood investigations were performed. Liver stiffness measurement was done with the help of a fibroscan, and controlled attenuation parameter was also done with the help of a fibroscan, and they were compared at baseline and at 24 weeks after treatment with saroglitazar 4 milligram. And you can see the results. There was a marked improvement in the liver enzymes as well as the lipid parameters as well as the scores in the fibroscan. So saroglitazar indeed leads to a significant improvement in the transaminases and the fibroscan scores also in NAFLD patients with diabetic dyslipidemia. Now I am coming to the last slide, and this is about the comparison between saroglitazar versus obeticholic acid and ursodeoxycholic acid. So I think these are the 3 drugs which we commonly use in fatty liver disease. So you know the mechanism of action. The key points are that it's saroglitazar's effect on insulin sensitivity is there. Also it is indicated in NAFLD and in diabetic dyslipidemia. It has a significant effect on liver fat and on the score reduction, and it has no significant side effects. Whereas ursodeoxycholic acid has to be given in many divided doses. It is actually replaces a toxic bile acid and does have some reduction in terms of liver enzymes and also in terms of fat reduction when given on long term, but we really don't know how long we can give these molecules because there's no research data till date. So saroglitazar is mentioned in the 2 major Indian expert consensus also. I'm finishing. In terms of the expert consensus given by the Lipid Association of India in 2020 and the RSSTI in 2022. So to summarize, for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, weight reduction and lifestyle modification are still the key elements, but not possible to sustain for a long time with it for some category of patients. And medications should have a reducing effect on both the NAFLD activity score as well as the fibrosis. Commonly used drugs are the pioglitazone, vitamin E, metformin, ursodeoxycholic acid, but they are all off-label medications for NAFLD treatment. Saroglitazar is the world's first approved medication for NAFLD from India. It reduces liver fat, liver enzymes, NAFLD activity score very significantly, and the guidelines expert consensus has mentioned the importance of saroglitazar in the management of diabetic dyslipidemia, which we are doing for years, and now for NAFLD also. So thank you all for a very patient listening, and thank you for inviting me here.
Dr. Ruchi, please come here. The fact that Dr. Vinay Agarwal sir has stayed till 10:15 is ample proof that your talk was worth listening to. Friends, as you understand, saroglitazar is a molecule which is impacting the very basis of the metabolic syndrome, MASLD, NAFLD, whatever you call it. Ma'am, wonderfully addressed. I want to ask you a question before I give it to Dr. Monica Mahajan, ma'am. Ma'am, when we are talking about NAFLD or MASLD, the central theme is losing weight. If you do not lose weight, everything else is useless. Your comment on that?
That is true, sir. Weight reduction in terms of diet restrictions and lifestyle changes, that is increased physical activity for the patient, is the mainstay of treatment in this disease. Pharmacotherapy is only indicated for a very few subset of patients as far as this disease is concerned. So I would still emphasize that the conservative approach of motivating the patient to lose weight is the mainstay of treatment as far as this disease is concerned.
Ma'am, would give her perspective, but on behalf of majority of the physicians who understand the metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance is at the basis of everything, as I understand. And insulin resistance is also playing a part in NAFLD. Unless and until we increase insulin sensitivity, you mentioned some drugs, pioglitazone, metformin, they are the drugs which are increasing insulin sensitivity. And there are newer drugs now, which you mentioned, saroglitazar, ma'am. And in the journey of NAFLD, from fatty liver, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, the inflammation sets in, OT-PT, gamma-GT rises, and then after inflammation, as we understand from the basic signs of inflammation, then the fibrosis sets in. Ma'am, where in this journey of fatty liver should we intervene so that we can achieve good outcomes?
So sir, I think the intervention has to be done in the beginning. As I said, that normally patients are identified in routine health checkups, and that is the stage where if we suspect a patient to be having cardiometabolic risk factors like obesity or diabetes, hypertension, and also slightly increased liver enzymes and a figure of say grade 1 fatty liver or grade 2 fatty liver reported on an ultrasound, these are the subset of patients which should be identified first, and treatment in terms of further investigation should be initiated for such patients. So we must send a fibroscan investigation for all such patients, and then based on the FIB score which we can calculate in our routine daily practice only, we can categorize the patient and then go further whether we have to refer the patient to the liver specialist based on the FibroScan report as well as based on the FIB score and other parameters, or we can manage the patient ourselves in primary care.
Ma'am, my last question to you. When we put the patient on saroglitazar, so is it like once on saroglitazar, always on saroglitazar?
I would say, I don't know, I think I'll ask Monica to answer this.
Okay, so to come to your first point, if you look at the most of the data coming from public schools in Delhi, almost 30% of children in any class are obese. The number of girls who are suffering from polycystic ovarian syndrome in schools, the number of children who are suffering from subclinical hypothyroidism, the number of children who are undergoing cholecystectomy before the age of 20 years. So I would say that looking at the metabolic syndrome, it is not starting to have an intervention once you are an adult. I would say answer to your question is that the intervention in terms of lifestyle needs to start from our schools rather than as adults. We are too late if we are waiting as adults to start treating NAFLD, because the earlier insulin resistance, the PCOD, the hypothyroidism, the obesity are all being witnessed in school children rather than in adults, so you need to intervene there. Schools in UK have banned any kind of fast foods in their canteens. Why can't we do that in India? It actually needs to be done here rather than in terms of UK looking at the obesity. Looking at the other question in terms of how long to give Lipaglyn or saroglitazar, it again depends on how much of effort the patient is putting into his lifestyle modifications. If the patient is able to reduce 10% of his body weight, he can actually get off saroglitazar, he can get off the diabetes medicines, and he can get off the statins, not just the saroglitazar, but 10% of reduction in the body weight. He can be off all of the diabetic drugs and have reversal of diabetes happening, not just the reversal and the improvement in the fatty liver. So that is what we are looking at. How long the patient needs it will depend on what he does with his diet and what he does with his exercise.
Great, man. Dr. Monica, HDL cholesterol is supposed to be one of the surrogate markers of insulin resistance. If a patient is obese, insulin resistance is high, HDL cholesterol is low. Is HDL cholesterol a marker for treatment when we are treating our patients with saroglitazar? Even a small rise in HDL cholesterol. Guys, we are having a serious discussion. Kindly please keep your noise volume low. Is HDL cholesterol a marker for your treatment and a guidance to treatment with saroglitazar? Your answer.
So if you look at the criteria for metabolic disease or in terms of metabolic dysfunction associated liver disease, you have 1 out of 5 criteria to meet with. The first one is the BMI. In a man, a waist circumference of more than 94. In a woman, a waist circumference of more than 80. You are looking at a fasting sugar of 100 and above. You are looking at a triglyceride more than 150. And you are looking at an HDL which is less than 40. So 1 out of 5 criteria, if you are fulfilling, you are suffering from metabolism dysfunction associated liver disease. And I am pretty sure anyone in this room would meet with 1 out of those 5 criteria, okay? And as far as the recommendations, as far as this particular drug is concerned, this is the only approved drug as far as utilization in metabolism or MASLD, or the old term in terms of NAFLD is concerned. And there is data in terms of the biopsy proven improvement in the fat content of the liver. There is MRI data in terms of MR spectroscopy in terms of improvement with this drug as far as the fat in the liver is concerned. And then there is the easiest FIB scores in the FibroScan. So in terms of the hard data, UDCA does not have that data, obeticholic acid does not have the data. The only drug which has histopathology data, has MR spectroscopy data, has in terms of the fibroscan data, in terms of the FIB scores. All four are met with only with this one drug, which is libaglin or saroglitazole. So that is the reason that this is the only approved therapy as far as NFLD is concerned. And the last point I need to make again is that I see a lot of patients who are undergoing liver transplant in India. With the hepatitis B immunization being now given in childhood, the number of people who are undergoing liver transplant in today's age and time in any hospital, the most important indication is not alcohol. The most important indication is not hepatitis B. The most important indication for liver transplant in today's age and time is diabetes with NAFLD, and that is the kind of havoc that this disease is creating, that people are ending up with cirrhosis and liver transplant not because they touched alcohol in their life, just because they were obese and diabetic. So that is the kind of havoc that the transplant curve indications have totally reversed, and the commonest indication for transplant for liver anywhere in the world is obesity and diabetes and not hepatitis B and alcohol. So if we can do anything in terms of a drug to protect the patient, why not give the benefit of the drug?
Doctor.
Let the evidence decide. Let the evidence decide again. See, now the probably terminology is going to reverse. See, MEFL 2020 and MESL 2023 by the Delphi organizations, and now probably the Journal of Hepatology and the Annals of Hepatology says that probably the reverse is there, true. Not MESL, but MEFL is the drug, is the nomenclature to be used today. Why? Because, see, MEFL criteria are better as compared to MESL. Why? Because the high risk of CKD is associated with greater risk of CKD in patients in MEFL, not with MESL. So, progression of CKD and evidence of CKD progression and probably diagnosis of CKD more with MEFL as compared to MESL. Like to have your words of wisdom on that.
Which one is the better term? Which defines
It's
it?
going to be reversed now.
I would say,
This is not what I am saying. This is the Annals of Hepatology, yet to be published in September, October 2024. Say so.
Yes, sir. So I think Massel defines it better because ultimately we are all talking about metabolic dysfunction, and these are all metabolic dysfunction diseases, whether it is a chronic kidney disease or diabetes or obesity. So I would say that this term describes it better.
Great. So it's more accurate in identifying patients who would probably progress to CKD. So what are the, we need to have one of the 5 criteria for cardiometabolic disorder along with the steatosis in MESL. But in MEFL we need to have at least 2 criteria out of the 7. So talk us about the 7 criteria we have in MEFL as compared to the MESL. Let me say.
The criteria of MFL.
Criteria is, in my knowledge, it is similar only in both diseases.
So BMI more than 25,
Age more than 50.
dysglycemia, HDL cholesterol,
Talking about MEFL or MESL?
MEFL, MFLD,
Okay, go ahead, sir.
triglycerides, waist circumference. So these are the 5 criteria I remember.
Those are MESL, sir.
No, can you just tell the other one
Yes.
which you know?
So LFT,
LFT,
KFT,
KFT,
and hepatitis markers.
okay,
At least 2 of the 7 criteria need to be present in MEFL.
okay,
That's it, sir.
right. So good, you answered the question, sir, you knew the answer. I knew it, Dr. Tulsi. I knew it, Dr. Tulsi, you already knew the answer. Yeah, next question.
Let's begin with the management man, both of you, and Dr. Johan as well. So AAC guidelines today recommend, reinforce probably, the importance of lifestyle modification and is the standard of care today. And however, the likelihood of success is often very modest. Why? Because of lack of adherence to. So pharmacological intervention is needed. Apart from what you said about, let's talk about the dietary regimens, Dr. Ruchi. So would you say probably the low glycemic index Mediterranean diet is the diet to be followed today? What do you say about the diet? Low.
So Mediterranean diet is actually a diet which is a high protein diet, but it also involves intake of vegetables and some complex, minimal complex carbohydrates. And some patients do well on this diet, but the ultimate aim of therapy would be in reduction, basically in total reduction of the calories for the patient. So that is what I had said in my talk also, that it is ultimately that the patient has to count the calories and reduce the calories in order to lose weight, and emphasize on regular physical activity as well. So whether it's a Mediterranean diet or a ketogenic diet or a intermittent fasting or any kind of diet which is comfortable for the patient to follow, the patient can follow that particular diet. The ultimate aim is to lose weight.
Let's talk a little about the major drugs which today have to be prescribed. I'm talking about the SGLT2 inhibitors, GLP-1 agonists. They have remarkable effects in reducing CV risk, renal benefits, risk of hepatic fibrosis and hepatocellular carcinoma as well. So also not to forget about the GLP, the dual GLP-1 and the GIP agonist, tirzepatide, and now the triple GLP-1 and the GIP and the glucagon agonist. I'm talking about tirzepatide, which is completing phase 3 trials. These are the drugs to be used today. What do you say, ma'am?
So as far as the GLP-1 receptor agonists are concerned, they have two indications. One is in terms of the diabetes management and the other is in terms of the weight management. So in terms of the molecules, the injectable GLP-1 receptor agonists we've been using for a pretty long period of time. And then came the era of the oral GLP-1 receptor agonist, which is in terms of the semaglutide or the Rybelsus. But Rybelsus, again, we need to understand that whatever the weight loss happens predominantly with a 14 milligram of Rybelsus. No weight loss happens with 3 milligram, and 7 milligram only causes a modest weight loss. So tirzepatide by Eli Lilly has now been put up for approval by the DCGI, and Wegovy has been in use, Mounjaro has been in use. These are both molecules which have been in use in US as injectable molecules for GLP-1, specifically only for weight loss, not even for diabetes, but as a standalone drug for weight loss, they have done very well. So we are expecting that tirzepatide should be in India in the next 6 months as far as the DCGI approves this drug. The only thing that you need to understand with tirzepatide or with any of the GLP-1 receptor agonists is that any family history of medullary carcinoma thyroid or a personal history of medullary carcinoma thyroid or multiple endocrine neoplasias, these are two contraindications as far as the use of any of the GLP-1 receptor agonists, whether it is semaglutide or tirzepatide is concerned. The other controversy that is happening with semaglutide is in terms of an article that was published in JAMA a few years ago. And that article talked about acute ischemic optic neuritis or ischemic involvement of the eye and blindness in a small percentage of patients on semaglutide. So although it was one standalone study in JAMA, but we need more evidence to see in terms of the safety of these drugs as far as GLP-1 receptor agonist is concerned. And the second concern is in terms of whether these drugs, how far do you screen a patient as far as carcinomas are concerned. So those are the two concerns with these drugs. Otherwise, the world over, whether it is in terms of the Ozempic or whether it is in terms of the Wegovy or it is in terms of the Mounjaro, all of these molecules are being widely used as weight loss drugs in all the fraternity, and we are expecting that India should be getting tirzepatide anywhere in the next 3 to 6 months.
So Dr. Manika, let's talk a little about the saroglitazar. So alpha 1 and alpha and gamma PPR agonists. So histological improvement in C is seen in NASH patients at 16 weeks, and I'm talking about the evidence through trials. And amongst this dual agonist, alpha is more as compared to the gamma PPR activity. So alpha is responsible for lipid peroxidation. So effect of alpha is more as compared to the gamma. And gamma would probably, reflect on the glycemic control, which is probably, taken a back seat in this. Having said that, what about the weight gain with saroglitazar because of his gamma activity?
So there is a small amount of weight gain
Weight
that
gain.
has been reported to the extent of 1%, 1.6%.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.